For this presentation, Improficiency and the Professionalization of Undisciplined Practices, my focus is on the intersection between disciplinary professionalization and interdisciplinary innovation. And in a way, it could be considered a micro-analysis of many of the themes and issues that we've already discussed this week. Now, my starting point for this particular talk is previously published work that suggested the idea of proto-practices, by which I mean practices or aspects of practices that come from or are influenced from beyond any recognized domain or community of practice. In other words, they'd be deemed improficient, illegitimate, they wouldn't be recognized. But the work that I was doing with practicing artists suggests that these kinds of practices, whether they're established or developed by accident or by trial and error, are not confined just to novices, the uninitiated, the untrained, but actually can be sustained and nurtured through professional development and become a defining feature of what I termed proto-elite practices. So in effect, it unsettles any clear distinction between legitimate professional practice at this end and illegitimate untrained practice at the other. But from my perspective, if we think that each discipline can kind of serve to provide a source of proto-practices for the other, then actually we're in the same situation, that we're unsettling those kinds of demands for equivalence of proficiency across the disciplines. So what I wanted to do today is to take those ideas further and apply them in a more analytical capacity to my own interdisciplinary practice. So I'll talk briefly through the context for and the nature of my research. I'll reflect briefly on the progress that I've made to date, but my main emphasis is going to be on the prospects going forwards for that way of working. And in particular, what I want to work towards is a sense of some of the implications as I see them for our understandings of interdisciplinarity itself, for the need to repoliticize or appreciate more the politicization that goes on in practices of disciplinarity, and specifically the implications for academic or interdisciplinary academic identities, practices, and careers. So, by way of an introduction, who or what am I? Well, yes, we're all here today, this week, as academics, but I haven't always been. So before I did my PhD, I had about a 10-year career in a range of roles, but primarily in local government, and with quite a strong emphasis on environmental management and policy, but moving into corporate and strategic policy. Within academia, yes, I identify as a geographer. However, I do not currently have a formal contractual arrangement with my own department, although my teaching supports their work, I examine for them and I publish in their name. However, I also publish in psychology, and my work draws heavily on psychology. I also, however, use artistic practice as a research method, and my work is often described by other people as being strongly anthropological in nature. So again, not so easy to place. Equally within geography, yes, I claim to be a human geographer. Well now, but as an undergraduate I was a physical geographer, and I have both educational and professional experience in environmental science and management. So already it's pretty easy to see that it's hard to locate either me or my work within standard classifications of professions, whether they're academic disciplines or something broader. Which of course throws up a whole range of challenges for me. Firstly, there's the practical question of how do I actually go about working across these disciplinary boundaries, of working with different knowledges, languages, epistemologies, and so on, which from the discipline's perspective no doubt raises questions about the relevance and legitimacy of my work, and the degree to which the way in which I use terms, like experimentation, for example, between geography and psychology, to what extent are they equivalent? Which for me gives me reasonably tricky issues to negotiate in terms of both disciplinary and interdisciplinary identities, because ultimately the very things that fire me up academically potentially risk shooting me down in flames in terms of my academic career, which is what's really stimulated my focus for today. But despite all of this diversity, there is a unifying thread that underpins it all, which is my interest in non-representational thinking. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into loads of detail on this, but it is important to outline some key features of it because it really lies at the heart of my interdisciplinary work and feeds directly into my methodological approaches. So non-rep, for short, thinking, is all about going beyond cognitivism, beyond representationalism. It really emphasises bodies, bodily capacities and sensibilities, practical doings that we get through life, the performative aspect of day-to-day living. And in particular, it's interested in the pre-reflective, all of those things that we do, all of those things that influence what we do, that we don't consciously think about. Emotions, intuitions, dispositions, those sorts of things. Now, conventional non-rep geography relies a lot on a certain philosophical lineage, incorporating the likes of Heidegger, Bergson, through to Deleuze and Guattari more recently. My work, however, via psychology, introduces to geography a new stream of thinking in the form of Eugene Gendlin's work. Now, Gendlin was a psychotherapist and a philosopher who had a long and distinguished career at the University of Chicago. And these two ways of approaching non-rep thinking use very different languages. So the pre-reflective in a general sense for conventional non-rep geography is under the term of affect. We talk about the affective aspects of life. Gendlin, however, uses terms like the implicit or implicit understanding. But to all intents and purposes, for today's purposes, they're basically just different names for the pre-reflective. Now, they share between them a biting interest in the role and value of the pre-reflective in human experience. But what they differ in is their perspective in terms of whether, how, and to what extent we can access, apprehend, and work with that pre-reflective experience in a deliberate capacity. So, in brief, what both branches agree on is that that pre-reflective, emotions or anything else, has a direct, sometimes influence on our cognitive processes, our conscious cognitions. So we might all be able to think of a time when we've been emotionally fired up about something, and it's affected our thought processes, the decisions we've made, the actions that we've taken. They also both distinguish between a kind of embodied internal sense of pre-reflective experience and a more environmentally based transpersonal sense of pre-reflective experience. So the counterpoint for affect would be atmosphere, whereas the counterpoint for the implicit would be felt sense, the felt sense of a situation. Where they differ, though, is in conventional non-rep geography, it's very much a one-directional flow of influence from pre-reflective to reflective. So in essence, we cannot dig down into our pre-reflective experience from conceptual understanding. They work on different logics, we just can't do it. As soon as we try to grasp or label some kind of affective experience, we lose the very quality that makes it what it is. For Gendlin, on the other hand, it's a different story. It's much more of a bidirectional relationship, and we do have some capacity to reach into our pre-reflective or implicit understanding and to work with it on a more intentional basis. He does argue that it's very much an imperfect capacity, partly because of the predominance of rational thinking since Enlightenment, but also partly because of our growing reliance and dependence on linguistic convention. So in essence, we've simply become unaccustomed to a large extent to working, drawing on this kind of pre-reflective capacity over successive generations. But for Gendlin, the important thing is that it's there to be tapped into and to be worked with. So the value for me in working with Gendlin's approach is precisely that bidirectionality. It opens up the door to a whole new suite of methodological possibilities. Not only do we think with the implicit in a daily sense, whether we're aware of it or not, but we can also think into the implicit in an intentional fashion. So yes, we can accept that things make logical sense. We can forge logical connections between different concepts in a theory, for example. But for Gendlin, there's also a more than logical or an implicit connectivity between these things. And because we can dig into it with Gendlin's understanding, we can use those implicit connections creatively. We can generate new conceptual understanding from our implicit understanding. And this is entirely what Gendlin's psychotherapeutic techniques have been all about, trying to help clients and patients to be able to grapple with what it is that's troubling them, that up until then they have been unable to articulate or to deal with. And in essence, my approach to my research has been to try and find non-clinical ways of achieving the same means. So in that sense, I'm taking Gendlin out of psychology, I'm undisciplining him, but I'm also deprofessionalizing him in the sense that I'm taking it out of the clinical capacity and putting it into geographical research. So my research itself can be characterized in three main ways. Reflecting its non-representational basis, it's very much practice-based, but it's also quite strongly autoethnographic. So yes, I do work with participants, but I also, in terms of the embodied capacities and sensibilities, I use my own practice quite strongly. The practice that up until now I've been most interested in is the practice of art, artistic practice. Now, I'm not an artist and I don't claim to produce art, but there's also a strongly Gendlinian aspect to this, because on his understanding, if we're trying to generate or articulate into reflective thought from our implicit understanding, it's often easier to do that if we allow images to form in the process. So image making, whether it's visualization or actual artwork, can act as a stepping stone on that process. So whereas for Gendlin, he might have used artistic practice or visualization as one of many techniques where the others are more conventional language-based types of therapy, I'm trying to use artistic practice instead of those more formal language-based techniques. I'm trying to use artistic practice as its own route into implicit understanding, and then to help us work up from there. So all of the methods that I've come up with and have tried are geared towards trying to draw attention, both participants and my own, to aspects of our practices that we would normally overlook, we just wouldn't consider, precisely because they work on that pre-reflective level. We just don't have cause to think about them. And one key way in which I've done that is to introduce comparison. So simply by working alongside somebody else artistically, we're both doing the same task, using the same materials in the same place, but actually by spotting how somebody else does the same task differently to us, prompts us to think more directly about how we ourselves do that task and why we do it that way. So already we're starting to get more of an insight into what we do and why we do it. Secondly, I seek to unsettle habituated practices. So if I'm working with a professionally trained artist, I might spend one session working with them in very familiar materials for both of us, and then another session we would each work in a very unfamiliar material. So in that sense, I'm deprofessionalizing them. I'm taking them out of their professional comfort zone and asking them to do the same task again. Now, part of that is still about this comparative aspect, but part of it is also about doing things differently in the moment. So creating moments in which by doing things differently, we also think differently. So it's bringing out this practice-based element again. Thirdly, I'm interested in improficient practices. So at the moment, in social science literature on practices, which is a massively growing field, the predominant emphasis is on elite practitioners or long-established practitioners because their skills are refined, their sensibilities are refined, they're at the peak of their performance, and therefore, the logic goes, we can learn a lot more from them. Now, I don't doubt that we can learn a lot from them, but I'm interested in what might actually be trained out of capacities and capabilities by that formal development process. Are there ways in which novices, the uninitiated, first-time practitioners, might actually be more sensitive to certain aspects of practice that we would otherwise miss if we only focus on elites? Which is stimulating me to push my work into new cultural practices, because after all, I can be just as improficient in a new practice as anybody else. So in terms of progress, the methods have certainly been trialled in terms of artistic practice. They're now getting published, and I'm looking to extend them and test them in new cultural practices. I'm also starting to generate potential conceptual contributions. So on the one hand, that might be simple linguistic novelties on the part of participants, which could, in a Gendlinian fashion, be unpacked further and worked through. It might be conceptual developments through my own autoethnographic practice, or it might be more formally theoretically oriented work, such as the idea of proto-practices in the development of expertise. And I'm also starting to think in a more pedagogical fashion. So what might the role and value of implicit understanding be in an educational context, both from the perspective of the learner and the teacher? But of course, as soon as we start thinking about potential contributions, our attention is drawn to the disciplinary spaces into which they're being parachuted. So whether I'm taking ideas, knowledges, practices from psychology into geography or vice versa, does the receiving discipline simply absorb that new material without so much as a ripple on the surface? Or am I perhaps extending the boundaries of each discipline slightly so that the interdisciplinary space between them is ever so slightly shrinking? To what extent and in what ways might my work be considered genuinely inter, multi, or transdisciplinary? And what do we mean by all the nuanced differences between those prefixes? On the other hand, do I risk finding myself in some academic no man's land, where I cannot engage meaningfully with any of the disciplines that I'm trying to talk to? Or even more bizarrely, might I be carving for myself some micro enclave of psychogeography that only I can recognise? Who knows? But again, it's very uncertain in terms of positionality, in terms of identity, which can understandably be pretty uncomfortable. But I think it's also quite uncomfortable for disciplines because, let's face it, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So disciplines are still important in terms of the allocation of recognition, resources, and so on. They also still set the benchmarks and standards for legitimacy, proficiency, what counts as professionalism. And of course, they're still policing their boundaries in terms of the identities, who and what belongs and who doesn't. But they're also competitively situated, the fight for funding and prestige for one. They're also externally influenced. I don't know how international the impact agenda goes, but in the UK we're increasingly forced to pre-specify our extra academic impacts from our research before we've even applied for the funding to do the research. And disciplines are also both diversely and politically populated. So at any one point, individual and institutional protectionism, disciplinary identity politics can be brought into force. So there's a whole swathe of structural constraints and power dynamics that come into effect here. And I want to draw attention to two particular features that are being picked up more and more in social science work in a an applied capacity. So I've picked up on it mainly through local and neighbourhood planning, but I think we can discern it quite readily within disciplinary practices and processes as well. So the first of these, PostPolitics, by that what I mean is a proceduralised focus on technicalities in order to avoid any substantive political issues or debates. And the example I would use for that is that impact agenda I mentioned just now. Because the more time we have to spend chasing our tails trying to pre-specify things that we haven't done yet, actually we have less and less time to think about the political implications of the impact agenda overall, and the types of work that are thereby excluded. And at this point, I'd probably suggest that interdisciplinary work is particularly vulnerable here, simply because of the added uncertainty as to how new knowledge or practices from one discipline are going to be received in potentially a very different other discipline. Secondly, post-democracy is really referring to any claims or initiatives that rhetorically aim to include people, but in practice serve to exclude people. So the example I'm going to choose for that is interdisciplinarity itself. So over recent years, there's been quite a drive to do more interdisciplinary work. However, the literature does strongly suggest that only certain models of interdisciplinarity are considered legitimate practice, specifically team-based approaches to interdisciplinarity. So we might have a team of 5 academics, all from different disciplines, coming together to generate collaborative outcomes, which would be deemed interdisciplinary. But each individual academic would still be strongly bound to their own discipline, which is great for work that needs to be team-based or benefits from being team-based. But where does that leave academics who work in slightly different ways? Academics who, as individual practitioners, actually have each foot in a different camp. Supposedly my work is kind of disallowed, it's excluded on that basis. So what we have, if we try and think spatially about kind of what the disciplines are doing in terms of responses to this, on the one hand we've got an extensification at the discipline's edges through this kind of drive to interdisciplinarity. But at the same time and in response, we also have reinforcement, intensification, concentration of disciplinarity at its core, which, thinking through this thought experiment a bit further, raises interesting questions as to how, if at all, might my kind of interdisciplinary work find its feet in terms of establishing its legitimacy and proficiency? So 3 possibilities here. Is there scope for any interdisciplinary proficiency standards? I would argue no. Because as soon as you get a particular constellation of interdisciplinary practices, it is the different disciplines who are going to be wrangling over who has priority in setting the standards for proficiency and legitimacy. So you end up simply in a disciplinary battleground. So what's the alternative? Undisciplined improficiency? Staying in the middle? Doing that kind of no man's land that no one's engaging with? Well, okay, I could do that. It would be a lot of fun. But in terms of career prospects, it's not really a starter. Because then I end up in that academic no man's land forever, permanently excluded and ignored. So, career goes downhill. So a third option, perhaps, is a possibility of professionalized indiscipline. And in a way, this is where I'm working towards with the Gendlin stuff. So I've taken Gendlin's ideas out of psychology, undisciplining them, and I'm trying to re-professionalize them for geography, because that's the discipline I'm trying to inject them into. And my argument there is that making things is essentially a geographical, it's a spatial practice. And therefore it doesn't matter 2 hoots whether it's done by a novice or an expert, because it's the practice of making in non-representational terms that I'm interested in, not the quality of the outcome. Yay! No. Because all that does is reimpose disciplinarity. I still have to discipline it for geography in order to get legitimacy and in order to establish proficiency. So seemingly, whichever way I try and tackle it, it ends up with interdisciplinarity being externalized and delegitimized by the ongoing dominance of disciplinary power over standards of legitimacy and proficiency. So, my little brain kept going, and what I'm getting to is the sense that the whole idea of interdisciplinary work is totally the wrong term, that the inter does not work. Because from the discipline's perspective, if no other, the interdisciplinary is always inherently extra-disciplinary. So if we have to think about jettisoning the idea of interdisciplinary practices, how might we reconceptualize the spatial relationship between emergent knowledges and practices and the discipline to which they're trying to speak? So a few suggestions to consider. On the one hand, we might think about para-disciplinary practices, with the prefix para here denoting externality, or alternative maybe abnormality, some sense of disorder. So the perception on the part of the discipline here might be one of threat to internal coherence, and the disciplinary response, therefore, might be to exclude that practice or knowledge. Trying to apply this to my own work, I think probably the philosophical side of Gendlin's work fits within there. I've certainly published on it, but I'm yet to see the explicitly philosophical side being taken up. Secondly, we might think about epi-disciplinary practices, where epi might mean being additional or supplementary to, or coming after a pre-existing disciplinary setup. So here it's not so much about threat perceptions, but maybe perceptions of a source of potential, at least some kind of acknowledgement on the part of the discipline in a more affirmative fashion. And I think the introduction of discordance, this unsettling of habituated practices, might fit within that category. Thirdly, how about peridisciplinary practices, where peri might mean being around or near or having some sense of alignment between new knowledge or practice and the pre-existing discipline. So this is much more about proximity, perhaps, and maybe the disciplinary response might look like an invitation to come closer into the fold. And probably, I think, the idea of inexpertise contributing to the growth of proficiency is probably the best fit in terms of my own work. And ultimately, of course, there's the golden standard of disciplinarity, where the new work is fully internalized and the discipline self-identifies with it. Unfortunately, I can't provide an example of that from my own work, quite simply because I don't think any of it's got there yet. So, this is very much work in progress. It's very much a thought experiment. It's not tied into the literatures, and this work has been produced purely for this symposium, so the discussion's going to be really interesting. But what I'm hoping it suggests is that there is the possibility of generating a suite of alternative terms, concepts, spatializations that can accommodate more readily the diverse spatial relations between emergent knowledges and receiving disciplines. But of course, the story doesn't stop there, because it raises its own questions, and I just want to talk through 3 here. So the first one, is this a patchwork or a process? The previous slide perhaps suggested a patchwork of practices or knowledges, each of which is related differently to the same discipline. But towards the end of that last slide, I also said that I didn't think any of my work had got there yet, which suggests perhaps that we can think about this in terms of a process of transformation, of gradual incorporation. But it also raises questions about the relationship between the practice or the knowledge and the practitioner that produces them. So if an academic practitioner is identified through the relationship of their knowledge and practical contributions to the discipline, then any one academic practitioner might be multiply and unstably related to that discipline at any one time. But might we also want to consider the potential to distinguish between the practices and the practitioner, whereby the practices or the knowledges are best associated with the discipline, but the practitioner might more appropriately be considered interdisciplinary on the conventional reading of it, effectively turning on its head that earlier example of team-based versus individual forms of interdisciplinarity. Maybe actually it's the individual who's best thought of as being interdisciplinary. Second question. Is all early interdisciplinary work on the conventional reading of it necessarily paradisciplinary work on that revised table just now? And I would suggest that the answer to that is no, because surely that would depend on the status of the practitioner concerned. As an early career academic, I have absolutely no guarantee that any of my work is going to be taken up by the discipline. But had that same work been done by the head of department at an elite institution, I suspect it would be a very different story. They would be able to pretty much guarantee not only that their work would be taken up, but that would happen swiftly. So what this does is it reinserts the political into our understandings of how disciplinary practices and processes work. And it does so in a reversal of that post-political trend I emphasised earlier, because the political here is being reinserted by virtue of our focus, or my focus, on the technicalities of the spatial integration of new knowledges into disciplines. So thirdly, how might this framework be useful? Well, from a purely academic sense, hopefully at least it provides a more nuanced analytical framework for thinking about the relations between knowledges, practices, and disciplines. But equally, because not only does it, for example, distinguish between the practices and the practitioners, it distinguishes between the perspective of the individual and the discipline, but it also potentially identifies a whole host of quasi-disciplinary spaces of emergent knowledges. But beyond that, and thinking in a more applied fashion, and this is where it gets quite self-indulgent, I'm afraid, is that we can think this through in terms of the implications for academic identities, practices, knowledges, and careers. Because thinking very specifically about my example, in this sense, I might be triply disadvantaged. My work might be excluded, at least in the short term, simply by virtue of my junior status as an academic. It might be excluded simply on the basis that it's interdisciplinary to start with. And it might be further excluded because I'm doing the wrong type of interdisciplinary work. The type of work I do is illegitimate at the moment. So potentially there is scope to take this further, which could be very interesting. But, looking at the timer, where does this bring us in terms of conclusions? In terms of space, I've phrased this the spatial curse of interdisciplinarity. And what hopefully I've established is that the inter is never properly inter. It's actually better thought of as being extra, at least from the discipline's perspective. And I've also hopefully shown that the inter is not sustainable, not simply because the space between disciplines shifts as the disciplinary boundaries shift, but also because at the level of the individual practitioner, it simply is disallowed. So surely we need some kind of reconceptualization of what on earth we mean when we talk about interdisciplinarity. Moving on to knowledge. Well, hopefully what I've managed to demonstrate, if we didn't already recognize it, is that the parameters of possibility for these emergent knowledges and practices are massively constrained by the dominance of disciplinary power over standards of legitimacy and proficiency. So what this suggests is not the rise or the demise of knowledge per se, but more the non-rise of certain types of knowledge, specifically the improficient, the undisciplined, the academically proto, which unfortunately for me makes the future of interdisciplinarity look pretty bleak, because I'm going to be potentially permanently excluded, permanently delegitimized, unless we can respatialize and repoliticize how we engage with ideas of disciplinarity. So, bringing knowledge and space together, what I would conclude is that while disciplinary spaces do construct disciplinary knowledges, interdisciplinary spaces do not, and I suggest cannot, construct interdisciplinary knowledges, because disciplinary spaces first deny and then destroy interdisciplinary spaces, and then either exclude or incorporate the interdisciplinary knowledges that would otherwise be associated with them, rendering them either not legitimate at all or rendering them no longer interdisciplinary. So, as I say, from my perspective as an early career academic who does the wrong type of interdisciplinary work, I don't have a very happy future ahead. But I don't want to end on such a dismal note, so let's put our optimistic heads on and think about where this kind of suggested embryonic framework might take us. Maybe it will lead to an expanded lexicon by which we can think about, in a more appropriate fashion, the diverse quasi-disciplinary spaces of emergent knowledges and practices. Maybe it will lead us to a renewed and reinvigorated appreciation for the implications of the politics of disciplinarity. And maybe, just maybe, it might herald a brighter future for interdisciplinary academics, practices, knowledges, and careers. Thank you very much for listening.